This is The Critical Thinker, episode 15. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Critical Thinker podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping us understand what it means to reason well and to be an independent critical thinker. I'm your host, Kevin Delaplante, and you can find more about me and my various projects at www.criticalthinkerpodcast.com and www.criticalthinkeracademy.com. I'd like to remind listeners that there's both an audio and a video version of the podcast that you can subscribe to on iTunes. You can view all the video podcasts, as well as many other tutorial videos I've uploaded on my YouTube channel. Just search for Philosophy Freak with a capital P and capital F, it's all one word, in the YouTube search bar. In this episode, I'm going to follow up on our previous discussion of confirmation bias by looking at an interesting attempt to explain confirmation bias drawn from the field of evolutionary psychology. In my commentary on this theory, the discussion hits on a bunch of topics, including the relationship between rhetoric and argumentation, the nature of biological functions, and an important virtue that I call epistemic humility. This is another longish episode, but I had 3 people email me after the last episode where I apologized for the length. These 3 people said that they enjoyed the longer episodes and told me not to sweat it, so I'm taking your advice and not sweating it. Okay, last episode, I talked a lot about confirmation bias, this tendency we have to filter and interpret evidence in ways that reinforce our beliefs and expectations. And I argued that one way to think about science and scientific methodology is as a set of procedures that function to neutralize the distorting effects of confirmation bias, among other cognitive biases, by forcing us to seek out and weigh even the evidence that might count against our beliefs and expectations. Now, there are 2 sides to cognitive bias research. There's the science that describes the effects of these biases on our judgment and behavior, and there's the science that tries to explain why we behave in this way, that tries to uncover the psychological or neurological or social mechanisms that generate the behavior. Everyone agrees that confirmation bias is a very real phenomenon. The descriptive part is well established. But not everyone agrees on the explanation for why we're so prone to this bias, what mechanisms are at work to generate it. And when there's disagreement at this level, there can be disagreement about how to best counteract the effects of confirmation bias. So as critical thinkers, I think that we should be interested in these debates for this reason, and because they're relevant on a deeper level to how we should think of ourselves as rational beings. In this episode, I want to talk about an interesting approach to these questions that has generated some recent buzz. It comes out of the field of evolutionary psychology, which is a branch of psychology that tries to explain and predict our cognitive functioning by showing how various aspects of this functioning can be viewed as evolutionary adaptations. This approach views these cognitive processes as products of natural selection, meaning that they were selected for because they helped our evolutionary ancestors survive and reproduce. What I'm going to be talking about is a view of human reason from this evolutionary perspective that offers an interesting explanation for the phenomenon of confirmation bias. So from this perspective, we can ask the broad question, why did human reason evolve? And by reason here, I mean a very specific ability, namely the ability to generate and evaluate arguments, to follow a chain of inferences, and to construct and evaluate chains of inferences that lead to specific conclusions. Human rationality can be defined much more broadly than this, but we're focusing on this specific component of rationality for the time being. Now, if we assume that this ability to construct and evaluate arguments is an evolutionary adaptation of some kind, the question then becomes, what is this ability an adaptation for? Well, here's one simple and obvious way to think about it. Our ability to construct and evaluate arguments evolved because it has survival value. And it has survival value because it helps us to arrive at truer beliefs about the world and to make better decisions that further our goals. This ability to reason is a general purpose tool for constructing more accurate representations of the world and making more useful and effective decisions. So we assume that in general, ancestral humans that are better able to reason in this way will have a survival advantage over those that don't. So we would expect that a higher percentage of individuals with this trait will survive and reproduce, and over time the trait will come to dominate the population. And that's why the trait evolved and persists in human populations. Now, if we accept this simple story, then we have an immediate problem. The problem is that when we look at the psychological literature, we see that human beings are often very bad at following and evaluating arguments, and they're often very bad at making good decisions. This is the take-home message of a good deal of the cognitive biases research that's been conducted over the past 40 years. To take the obvious example, human beings are systematically prone to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias leads us to disproportionately accept arguments that support our beliefs and reject arguments that challenge our beliefs. And this leads to errors in judgment. We think our beliefs are more justified than they really are. Now, from this simple evolutionary stance, the existence of confirmation bias is a bit of a puzzle. If reason evolved to improve the quality of our individual beliefs and decisions, then what explains the persistence of confirmation bias and other cognitive biases that undermine the quality of our individual beliefs and decisions? The new approach to these questions that is getting some recent attention tries to resolve this puzzle about confirmation bias. It's known as the Argumentative Theory of Reason, and it claims that the central adaptive function of human reasoning is to generate and evaluate arguments within a social setting, to generate arguments that will convince others of your point of view, and to develop critical faculties for evaluating the arguments of others. Now, this might not seem like a radical hypothesis, but I want you to note the contrast between this view and the previous one we just described. The previous view was that the central adaptive function of human reason was to generate more accurate beliefs and make better decisions for individuals. In other words, the function is to improve the fit between individual beliefs in the world, resulting in a survival advantage to the individual. The argumentative theory of reason rejects this view, or at least wants to seriously modify this view. It says that human reason evolved to serve social functions within human social groups. What are these functions? Well, imagine two ancestral humans who are trying to work together to collaborate to find food, defend against aggressors, raise children, and so on. This all works fine when both parties agree on what they want and how to achieve it. But if a disagreement arises, then their ability to work together is compromised. They need to be able to resolve their disagreement to get back on track. Now let's imagine that this pair of ancestral humans lacks the ability to articulate the reasons for their respective views, or the ability to critically evaluate the reasons of the other. They're stuck. They can't resolve their disagreement, and because of this, their collaboration will probably fail, and their partnership will dissolve. Now imagine another pair of ancestral humans in the same situation, who have the ability to articulate and evaluate their reasons to one another. They have the potential to resolve their disagreement through mutual persuasion. This pair is more likely to survive as a pair and to reap the benefits of collaboration. And for this reason, this pair will likely outcompete groups or individuals who lack the ability to argue with one another. And according to this theory, that's the primary reason why the ability to reason evolved in human populations, to serve the needs of collaboration within social settings, not to improve the quality of individual beliefs or to track the truth about the world. This story I've just told is known as the Argumentative Theory of Reason. It's the product of two French researchers, the well-known anthropologist and cognitive psychologist Dan Sperber, and his former student Hugo Mercier. I've got some links in the show notes for anyone interested in learning more about their work. One of the reasons they offer in support of their theory is that it helps to explain the existence of confirmation bias. How does it do this? Let's walk through this. It's kind of interesting. In a social setting where there are lots of different individuals with different beliefs and values, everyone's required to play two roles at different times. The role of the convincer, the one who is giving the argument that is intending to persuade, and the role of the convincee, the one who is the recipient of the argument and the intended object of persuasion. Now, if your goal as a convincer is to use reasons to persuade others, then a bias toward confirming arguments and confirming evidence is going to serve you well. As a convincer, your goal isn't the impartial weighing of evidence to get at the truth. It's to assemble reasons and evidence that will do the job of persuading others to accept your conclusion. Now, things are different when you're the convincee, the one who's the object of persuasion. In this context, you can imagine two extreme cases for how you should handle these attempts to persuade you. On the one hand, you could decide to accept everything that other people tell you, but that's obviously not going to serve your needs very well. You'll be pulled in different directions, you won't have stable beliefs, and you won't be effective at asserting your own point of view. On the other hand, you could decide to reject everything that other people tell you that doesn't conform to your beliefs. This is the ultra-dogmatic position. You stick to your guns, come what may. Now, this has some obvious advantages. You'll have a stable belief system, you'll attract collaborators who think the way that you do, and so on. But it's still obviously not ideal, because the ultra-dogmatic stance runs the risk of rejecting arguments with true conclusions that would actually improve their condition if they were to accept them. So, a better compromise position is one where there's a default dogmatism, where your initial reaction is to resist arguments that challenge your beliefs. But this default dogmatism is tempered by willingness and ability to evaluate arguments on their merits, and thereby make yourself open, in principle, to rational persuasion. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, this compromise position, which you might call moderate dogmatism, seems to offer the maximum benefits for individuals and for groups. Now, when you combine the optimal strategy of the convincer, which is biased toward arguments and evidence that support your beliefs, and the optimal strategy of the convincee, which is biased against arguments and evidence that challenge your beliefs, you end up with an overall strategy that looks an awful lot like the confirmation bias that psychologists have been documenting for decades. And this is what Sperber and Mercier are saying. When we think of reason as serving the goals of social persuasion, confirmation bias shouldn't be viewed as a deviation from the proper function of human reason. Rather, it's actually a constitutive part of this proper function. This is what it evolved for. To use a computer software analogy, confirmation bias isn't a bug, it's a feature. Now, I don't know if this view is right, but I admit I do find it provocative and worth thinking about. And at the top of the episode, I mentioned that different views on confirmation bias can result in different views of how best to neutralize or counteract it. Sperber and Mercier argue that their view has some obvious consequences along these lines. For one, their view implies that the worst-case scenario is individuals reasoning alone in isolation. Under these conditions, we're most prone to the distorting effects of confirmation bias. A much better situation is when individuals reason in groups about a particular issue. This way, everyone can play the role of the convincer and the convincee, and we can take advantage of our natural ability to evaluate the quality of other people's arguments, and others can evaluate the quality of our arguments. We should expect that reasoning in groups like this will result in higher quality judgments than reasoning in isolation. And in fact, lots of studies on collective reasoning do bear this out. But of course, not all groups are equal. If a group is very homogeneous, with lots of shared beliefs and values and background assumptions, then the benefits of group reasoning are more limited because there are collective confirmation biases that won't be challenged. So, if we're looking to maximize the quality of our judgments and our decisions, the better situation is when the groups are not so homogeneous, when there's a genuine diversity of opinion represented within the group, and you can expect that at least some people will start off disagreeing with you. Under these conditions, the benefits of group reasoning and group argumentation are greatest. The result will be judgments that are least likely to be distorted by confirmation bias. This is one of the conclusions that Sperber and Mercier arrive at. Now, I don't think you need to accept the whole evolutionary framework to understand the benefits of group argumentation, but it is an interesting explanation for why the quality of argumentation varies in this way, from lowest involving individuals in isolation to highest involving heterogeneous groups. So, what are the takeaway messages of this story for us as critical thinkers? I have 3 in mind. Number 1, I think it's clear that it can be very enlightening to take an evolutionary perspective on the origins and nature of human reason. But we need to be careful about how to do this. Almost everyone thinks that evolutionary biology can and should shed light on psychology. But evolutionary psychology, in the form that Sperber and Mercier practice it, has its critics. Telling a compelling story about the possible evolutionary advantages of a trait isn't enough to establish that the trait really is an adaptation that was selected for because of those advantages. Evolutionary views need to be defended against non-evolutionary alternatives, and specific evolutionary stories need to be defended against alternative evolutionary stories. But this is just to say that we need to be careful about the science. For now, I'm just going to mention this and put aside the question of the status of the science. Okay, here's a second takeaway message. I think we shouldn't be surprised if some may see troubling skeptical implications in Sperber and Mercier's theory. I don't think these skeptical worries are warranted, but the shift in perspective does have implications worth thinking about. So what are these possible troubling skeptical implications? Well, remember that the theory involves a shift from thinking of the primary function of human reason as improving the quality of our individual beliefs and decisions, to thinking of the primary function as persuasion within human social groups. Now, one possible worry is that this shift threatens to collapse the distinction between argumentation and rhetoric that optimists about reason would like to maintain. Rhetoric is about persuasion broadly construed. Argumentation is traditionally viewed as either distinct from rhetoric or as a special branch of rhetoric that focuses on persuasion for quote-unquote good reasons. It's the good reasons part that distinguishes argumentation from mere persuasion, and that connects it to the broader concepts of truth and rational justified belief that we emphasize in Western science and philosophy. So, some might conclude that if Sperber and Mercier are right, that the primary evolutionary function of human reason is social persuasion, then it turns out that argumentation really is just about persuasion, and not about truth or developing rationally justified beliefs. Some might think that it warrants a form of skepticism about our ability to improve the quality of our beliefs and decisions through reason and argument. Now, my reading of Sperber and Mercier's theory is that it doesn't support this kind of skepticism about human reason. I'll offer two reasons why. First, the story that Sperber and Mercier give about the evolutionary function of reason explicitly builds in a capacity for critically assessing the quality of arguments. But this capacity is grounded in our roles as convincees, not as convincers. From the perspective of someone on the receiving end of an argument, the capacity to distinguish good from bad arguments is genuinely adaptive. And the theory predicts that human reason retains this capacity. What Sperber and Mercier add is that human reason is also adapted for social persuasion. And the goals of social persuasion are sometimes in conflict with the goals of truth-finding and belief justification. So it's a messier, less unified view of human reason that they're advocating, but it's not inconsistent with the traditional view of reason as a means of distinguishing good from bad reasons for belief. The second point I want to raise has to do with this talk of evolutionary functions. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that human reason evolved primarily for social persuasion, that our ability to construct and follow arguments was selected for the advantages it afforded in terms of social persuasion and social collaboration. In other words, we're granting that it didn't evolve for the purpose of improving the quality of our individual beliefs and decisions. Sperber and Mercier don't actually go this far, but let's assume it for the sake of argument. Now, does it follow, if this is the case, that human reason does not today have the function of improving the quality of individual beliefs and decisions? It's tempting to say yes, given the way I've set it up, but the answer is no, this doesn't follow. To think this way is to make a basic mistake about the nature of biological functions. It's the fallacy of assuming that if a trait evolved for a given function, then it can only serve the function that it evolved for. In biology, there are lots of examples of traits that originally evolved for a given function, but that later were used for other purposes and became part of the natural function of the trait. A classic example is bird feathers. Almost all evolutionary biologists agree that feathers originally evolved to aid in heat regulation, not for flight. It was only later that they were co-opted and shaped by natural selection for flight. They were also co-opted for display and selection of mates. So that's three functions right there. So, even if we granted that human evolution evolved initially as a tool for social persuasion in the service of collaboration, it doesn't follow that our capacity for reason couldn't have been co-opted for other purposes and shaped by natural selection for other functions, like improving the reliability and accuracy of our beliefs about the world, or for other functions entirely. Okay, so what's my third takeaway message? It's this. Background knowledge like this helps develop strategies and attitudes that can improve the quality of our judgments and decisions. This message is one that I've been trying to emphasize in the podcast, and it has to do with the importance of background knowledge for critical thinking. In previous episodes, I've distinguished three different kinds of background knowledge that are relevant for critical thinking. The first is background knowledge related to subject matter, the topic under discussion. The second is background knowledge related to the intellectual history of debate over a particular issue, the history of argumentation that has shaped the way people view the issue. And the third is background knowledge related to how the human mind works, how we actually form beliefs and make decisions. The views on the evolution of human reasoning that I've been talking about here, along with the 2 previous episodes on cognitive biases, fit into this third category of background knowledge. From my perspective, it's clear that the more we understand how our minds actually work, the greater is our ability to bring critical thought to bear on our judgments and decisions. The irony, however, is that sometimes what we learn is discouraging. We learn that we're less rational than we think we are. We're more prone to errors and overconfidence than we think we are. My point is that this is still useful information because it can help us develop strategies for managing our irrationality in a rational way. It can help us identify the sorts of psychological attitudes and dispositions that are most conducive to critical thinking. For example, if we know that we're prone to confirmation bias, but this bias can be neutralized by following certain scientific protocols or by reasoning together in diverse groups, then this can lead to strategies for effectively managing and reducing the effects of this bias. Also, if we know that we're prone to confirmation bias and we know that we're also prone to overconfidence, then it helps us identify certain attitudes or virtues that should be cultivated to help avoid the effects of these biases. Now, one of these attitudes is what I like to call epistemic humility. Epistemic is a philosopher's term that means pertaining to knowledge. So in this respect, I'm talking about humility regarding the status of our knowledge and our capacity to reason well. Now, this isn't the same as skepticism about knowledge. To be epistemically humble isn't necessarily to doubt our knowledge or to deny the possibility of knowledge. It's rather to adopt an epistemic stance that is appropriate to and that acknowledges our situation as fallible, limited beings that are prone to overconfidence and error. Now, the degree to which we're prone to error will vary from context to context. The key idea here is that the quality of our judgments is highest when our epistemic stance, the attitude we take toward our own status and capacities as knowers, properly matches the epistemic environment in which we find ourselves. For example, if we're reasoning all by ourselves, this is a different epistemic environment than if we're reasoning with a diverse group of people. Given what we know about reasoning, it's appropriate to adopt a greater degree of epistemic humility when we're reasoning by ourselves than when we're reasoning with a diverse group. And sometimes the appropriate stance is simply to not trust our own judgments at all. That's an extreme form of humility, but in the right circumstances, it can be the most rational stance to take. A classic example of this kind of rational humility can be found in the Greek story of Odysseus and the Sirens. The Sirens were these mythic female creatures who sang these beautiful songs that lured sailors into the water or to crash their boats onto the shores of their island. Odysseus was very curious to know what the Sirens' song sounded like, but he understood that he may not be able to resist their song, so he did something very clever. He had all his sailors plug their ears with beeswax and tie him to the mast. He ordered his men to leave him tied tightly to the mast, no matter how much he might beg to untie him. Now, when he heard the Sirens' beautiful song, he was overcome by it, and he desperately wanted to jump into the sea to join them. And as he predicted, he ordered his sailors to untie him, but they refused based on his earlier orders. So, as a result of his strong sense of rational humility regarding his own capacity to resist persuasion, Odysseus was able to experience the Sirens' song and come out unscathed, where other men with less humility were lured to their deaths. For critical thinkers, the moral of this parable should be clear, though it may seem counterintuitive. By accepting and even embracing our limitations and failings as cognitive agents, rather than denying them or struggling against them, it's possible to improve the quality of our judgments and make more rational decisions than we would otherwise. But to pull this off, we need to cultivate the right kind of epistemic virtues that are informed by the right kind of background knowledge. And through knowledge and experience, learn to develop the appropriate judgment about the right level of epistemic humility to adopt in any particular circumstance. So that's my third takeaway message. And that about wraps it up for this episode of the Critical Thinker Podcast. I'm very interested in this concept of epistemic humility and other character virtues that are important for critical thinking, so I'm sure I'll have more to say about this in some future episode. I'm always happy to get feedback from listeners, So if you'd like to leave a comment on this episode, you can find it at www.criticalthinkerpodcast.com. Or if you'd like to send me a note, there are some handy contact forms at criticalthinkerpodcast.com and criticalthinkeracademy.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.